Hi, everyone. This is Juliana Connolly with HRP. We're just going to give people a few minutes to get into the meeting. We'll get started in a couple minutes. Okay, good evening, everyone. We'll get started. My name is Juliana Connolly, and I lead environmental remediation activities for HRP Group. And in a few minutes, I'm going to turn this presentation over to Kevin Long with TerraPhase. TerraPhase is one of the environmental consultants that works with HRP on the cleanup of the former refinery. In tonight's meeting, as Kevin will talk about in more detail, is about regulatory closure of 3 areas at the property that were previously used to store hazardous waste. So hazardous waste was stored at these locations on the property before it was then transported off-site for appropriate disposal. These areas are no longer in use for that purpose, and that's sort of the closure process that we're going through now. So that's what this meeting is about tonight. There's lots of other activities going on at the property, and we do have a broader public meeting on the evening of June 18th. So if you have questions this evening that relate to something other than the closure of these hazardous waste storage areas, we would encourage you to join us on June 18th, where there'll be a broader representation of HRP's staff that can answer questions on other topics. Tonight, we're really just focused on these hazardous waste storage areas and their closure. So the next meeting is on June 18th. That's a broader meeting, and information about how to sign up for that meeting will come out tomorrow. In terms of question and answers for tonight's meeting, we'll do that Q&A at the end of Kevin's presentation. And there's 2 ways that you can ask questions. You can either type your question into the Q&A, like through Zoom directly. You can just type it in, or at the end of the presentation, you'll be able to virtually raise your hand. There's a little button at the bottom of your screen that says raise your hand. If you click that button, we'll be able to unmute you, and if you want to, you can share your video as well and ask your question just the way that I'm talking now. So all of the questions will come at the end. You can either type your question in, which you can do at any point. You can do while you're listening, or you can do at the end, or you can ask your question directly, and that will just come at the end. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Long.
Thank you, Juliana.
Thanks, Kevin.
Okay, I'm going to advance the slides. So I'm actually privileged to have the opportunity to present this information tonight. We're going to be covering the closure efforts for 3 hazardous waste storage units that formerly exist at the refinery. Let me get to a point where we just kind of give you an overview of things that we'll cover and some of the content that I'll be going through. First thing, the purpose of this meeting we'll talk a little bit about some of the aspects of regulating hazardous waste storage. We'll also talk a little bit about some other aspects that are important to the investigation of these areas. We'll talk about historic fill and other sources of contamination. And then I'll actually go through a discussion about a supplement, an actual agreement that was created between PESRM and PADEP that governs the process that PESRM was going to follow as part of their efforts to close each of these 3 units. And then I'll catch you up on the status of where we are with regards to the actual characterization of each area. We'll talk a little bit about what we found, and I'll go through a little bit of the details on the conclusions that we've reached. I'll outline what the next steps will be, what to expect in the near future for each of these areas as we move forward. And then, as Juliana just mentioned, we'll go through a process of providing you the opportunity to answer or ask any questions you might have, or provide any comments that are associated with this closure effort. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you should see three. I'm actually going to turn something on so I can point to various aspects as we go through this. But you'll see three individual areas. This black line, this kind of area that you see here, this is actually the outline of the former refinery. It's the property itself. The three areas I'm going to talk about are, one of them is actually in the northern portion of the refinery. It's called Point Breeze, and it's a hazardous waste storage pad. You can see it here. It's on a relative scale, it's relatively small, the facility. The other area is called the Girard Point spent caustic tanks. There are actually two tanks in this area. They had numbers. One was 1086 and 1087. And then lastly, also in the southern end, it's Girard Point portion of the facility, there was another hazardous waste storage pad. So those are the three areas that I'm going to touch on tonight. We'll talk a little bit about the process that PESRM has been working through with DEP to close each of those units now that they are out of service. So the purpose of this meeting is really just to catch everyone up, to give everyone an update on the status of where we are with regards to this closure effort, and then also to give the public, to give each of you an opportunity, if you wish, to ask any questions related to this overall closure process. Now, I want to step back a little bit and I'm going to touch on hazardous waste and the regulations that pertain to hazardous waste, and then even the hazardous waste closure process itself. So hazardous waste is material that is generated at industrial sites, including at refineries. There are different classifications or categories that we put hazardous waste into. You may hear them be referred to as toxic or corrosive. You can see them on the left-hand side here: ignitable and reactive. Those are the categories that we give hazardous waste. And there are federal and state regulations that actually govern the management of this material as it's generated at these types of sites. Those regulations not only govern how that material needs to be disposed of, but also how it needs to be handled immediately from its creation all the way to its eventual disposal. And part of those rules require or provide for an opportunity for limited areas of a site to be used for storage. In this case, the 3 units that we talked about on the previous slide. And those storage units are really an opportunity to give a facility something that they can temporarily, for a short period of time, manage that material before it can be moved off-site for proper disposal. Now, those storage areas actually have to follow very strict guidelines. In addition to undergoing inspections, there's all sorts of labeling requirements, record-keeping protocols that the facility has to use in handling this material. Now, when a storage area gets to a point at which it's no longer needed, or it's at a point where it doesn't need to be used for a facility, it will go through a closure process. And that's a fairly formal process. That process involves elements of decontamination. It can involve elements of decommissioning. And then subsequently, the area will get sampled to determine if there's any evidence of actual releases of material from these units. If there is any contamination that's identified, the contamination can be remediated before the actual closure is achieved. All of that process is really entails getting to an outcome where you have long-term protective conditions for both the public as well as the environment after closure. So this is a very broad overview of the regulatory aspects that have governed the actual closure process for each of these 3 areas. So as a bit of additional background, one of the things that has been observed throughout the entire facility is fill material in the form of gravel or used asphalt, in some cases brick, that was used to actually level certain areas of the site and actually other areas of Philadelphia as part of historic development. And these are areas that were filled with low-lying areas filled with these types of materials. And the state actually refers to this type of material as historic fill. And historic fill can oftentimes include things like certain metals. So arsenic and lead are examples. You can also find low levels of certain chemicals that we refer to as semi-volatile organic chemicals. A part of that group of semi-volatile organics includes another family called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. You may hear me during the course of these slides refer to PAHs. That's really what I'm referring to. I'm referring to certain chemicals that fall into this semi-volatile category that we find commonly in this historic fill material. And what PAHs are really just the result of organic material that has gone through, it's called incomplete combustion, but basically burning. So you can find it in situations where you have burned wood or gas or oil. You can even find it on the charred portions of grilled meat. So any organic material that goes through an incomplete burning, you end up generating these chemicals as a result. What you see on the screen is actually what we refer to as a cross-section. In your mind's eye, you can think of it as taking a slice through the actual, or through a particular site, and looking at how the soil appears to be characterized. So this is an actual slice that was taken through, based upon sampling information that was collected at the southern end of the facility. So this is part of the Girard Point. So it's in close proximity to where both the Girard Point hazpad as well as those spent caustic tanks were located. And one of the things you can see is that historic fill is somewhat ubiquitous across this area of the facility, where the first level of soil that we encounter before we get into naturally occurring levels is predominantly made up of this historic fill material. The same is true on the northern end of the site. Again, this is another cross-section. It's produced by another company, but it's looking basically west to east. So you can see this is where the Schuylkill River is in this cross-section. And the same thing, you can see the initial material that has been observed. And again, at various thicknesses. I think the facility, through all of the sampling that's been conducted, I think this material can exist to several tens of feet below ground surface. So it is clearly a material that was used to help develop this area of Philadelphia. But again, it's not surprising it was also used in other areas of the city. The other condition that we have here is other areas besides, or other impacts that may be associated with other aspects of operations at the refinery that previously occurred. You'll hear me refer to these impacts as pre-existing contamination or contamination that's associated with other refinery related activities. Now, the reason this is important is because when we go through the process of working through the closure of these types of units, and we conduct sampling, one of the challenges that we have is trying to figure out whether what we found is associated with an actual release from a unit like this, or whether it's associated with these other aspects, associated with fill or with other types of sources of contamination. Now, that's not to say that if contamination like this from other sources from fill is discovered, it would be ignored or tossed aside. In fact, it actually would be managed just in a different way under a different program. In this case, you'll hear me refer to Act 2, and I'll get into that in a little bit here. But any contamination that was identified as part of our work that we have determined is not associated with these units would then be subsequently addressed under Act 2. So that can include things like lead, which also can be associated with historic fill. But the graphic that you see here in the middle of your slide, or in the middle of your window, is actually a presentation of all of the soil sampling locations where lead has been analyzed at the site. You see the same thing over here on this slide, or this picture. This is of benzene. And so we can use some of this information to try to help us understand whether what we find is associated with release from a unit, or whether it might be associated with these other sources. Now, I previously mentioned Act 2. Act 2 is actually a cleanup program that was established in the mid-90s by PADP. It encourages the cleanup of various types of sites. And part of that program actually establishes standards or cleanup levels that we can use to make decisions about the need for action or to understand the nature and extent of contamination using these generic cleanup levels. They're referred to as medium specific concentrations. Sometimes people will use the acronym MSC. The image that you see on the right-hand side is just an example of one of the tables that presents some of these cleanup levels. This table actually shows, for a list of chemicals, again, it's just a snapshot of one of the tables, numbers that are based on residential exposure, others that are based on non-residential exposure. And these cleanup levels are actually divided into two groups. We have numbers that are based on direct contact exposure, so actually coming into contact with material, actually humans coming into contact with chemicals in soil. And then there's a second set of numbers that are associated with the protection of groundwater. So chemical concentrations in soil that, if met, should not pose a risk to groundwater that would be a problem if it were to be used for potable purposes, if those contaminants were to leach. So I'm going through this only because, as part of this agreement with PADEP, and I mentioned this supplement to the closure plan, part of it involved using these, even though we're not doing this under Act 2, but using these generic cleanup levels as a tool in helping us understand whether the conditions of clean closure were met or whether more work needed to be done. So this supplemental agreement between PADEP and PESRM involved, after demolition, the collection of soil samples, and then the comparison of what we find in those soil samples to these generic cleanup levels. If the concentrations were equal to or less than these generic cleanup levels, then the state agreed that that would be a condition in which we could conclude that we had met the requirements of RCRA clean closure. Now, if we had concentrations that were above that, it just means that we have to do more work. Now, that additional work involves first trying to determine whether what we found is related to an actual release from the pad or from the unit, or whether that contamination potentially is associated with other sources. If it is in fact related to the pad, then as part of this closure effort, we would have to conduct a more rigorous risk assessment, determine whether there's actually any unacceptable risks to public health and the environment, and if so, implement a remedial action. However, if the contaminants that we find are not associated with release, let's say they're related to fill or they're related to another source, then we could conclude at that time that with regards to at least the closure of these areas, the requirements for clean closure are met. And that contamination that was observed or identified would have to be managed under Act 2. So I'm gonna start with the Point Breeze hazardous waste storage pad. This is the area that's to the north. It's in the northern portion of the former refinery. The pictures that you see on your screen are the dates that you see are the actual dates that these images were taken. So they're not necessarily an indication of when certain things happened, but they're intended to give you a little bit of an overview of how things played out over time. So on the left-hand side, you can see in 2018, this is at a time when the pad was still being used to support the operations at the refinery. Then in 2021, you can see an actual period when the materials were no longer being handled at the pad was cleared and prepped for decommissioning. And then in the picture to the right, you can see in 2022, you can kind of make out the footprint of the pad, but you can see that this is now at a point where there's access to the material, the soil that's underlying the former pad. So the way in which this process played out, actual individual plans were created for each of these areas that spelled out for the state's review and approval how soil sampling would be conducted, where it would be conducted, to what extent, in order to help us understand whether these pads, whether these units have had any releases of what they were managing to the environment. In the case of the Point Breeze hazardous waste storage pad, the plan was actually submitted in 2021. Sampling was conducted in 2 months during 2022. And it basically involved the collection of about 50 soil samples and, the installation of 46 soil borings and about 50 soil samples from those borings. And you'll see in a slide pretty soon here that the actual sampling locations themselves that were established in this plan were a mixed bag. You had locations that were biased or targeted towards those areas of the pad where that were specifically designed to actually collect fluid material. So these are areas where if there had been a greater likelihood of a release, these would have been good places to look. So there were targeted locations. There were also locations that were randomly distributed in order to give us good broad spatial coverage across the pad, and I'll show you those in a second. And then there was some subsequent sampling done just as a follow-up effort to try to help us get an understanding of the spatial distribution of some of the things that were found in the March sampling. Each of the samples were analyzed for a group of chemicals that are routinely used in analyzing soil samples at the refinery as part of lots of different activities, whether that's stuff under Act 2 or other purposes. But then the sampling list, the actual analysis list, was expanded to include chemicals that were also potentially present in some of the hazardous waste materials that were stored on this pad. So the actual list of chemicals that were analyzed as part of the sampling was conducted in this area was fairly broad. So the state had a chance to look at this and give us some input and some feedback. So this is a little bit of a busy slide, but I'll hopefully just kind of walk you through just a couple of elements here so you can kind of see what I was referring to on the previous slide. So what you see in blue, those are the locations that were targeted. Those are biased towards places where fluid might be present or stored, again, even stormwater. So, there were actual trenches that were in the pad itself. Again, for stormwater management, there were the actual drainage pipes. There were some clean out areas. There was some areas of spalled concrete. So those blue locations give you a good understanding of where specifically we cited locations on the basis of what we were expecting or hoping to potentially use as the greatest opportunities for us to find releases if they had actually occurred. And then you'll see there's a gray grid. Again, these are just individual boxes. I'll try to track it here with my mouse. And within those boxes, if there was a portion of the pad that didn't have a sample, so you can see these green points, these are locations where if we sort of looked through one of these boxes and we didn't see a point, we dropped a sampling location. So what that did is it gave us pretty good spatial coverage across the entire pad. And then, as I mentioned before, there were a couple of locations that were installed after the fact, just to give us more information about the spatial distribution, some of the chemicals that were found. Okay, so what did we find? So again, I'm going to refer to these MSCs, or these generic cleanup levels. And remember, there's direct contact-based numbers and there's soil to groundwater protection-based numbers. So that's what these two boxes are capturing for you. So what did we find? We found PAHs, these three specific PAHs in soil at concentrations greater than the direct contact numbers, and we found lead. Similarly, with regards to soil to groundwater, we found PAHs and again lead. So everything else that was analyzed at this pad was equal to or less than these generic cleanup levels. It's really just these two sets of group chemicals that we needed to explore in a little more detail. And this is just a graphic to illustrate where those concentrations were slightly higher than those MSCs. You can see this legend down here will give you a little bit of sense of that. The direct contact concentrations are in these orange locations, and the blue shows you where we had soil to groundwater concentrations greater than those MSCs. Now, one of the things that was observed in all the sampling, it's not terribly surprising. Same thing that was seen in the northern area is again, fill material that basically underlied this entire unit. So I'm going to shift gears and move to the south of the refinery, the former refinery. We're now in the Girard Point area of the facility. It's down near the Schuylkill towards the south. Again, same thing. These are three images to try to give you a sense of how things played out. The image on the left-hand side is at a time, ironically, it's at a time when the refinery was operating and the tanks were being used to manage any spent caustic. You can see in 2022, the tanks are gone. They've been removed as part of tank demolition and decommissioning, and they've been taken out of service. And then in the graphic to the right, you see the condition in which the actual pad itself, the tank footprints had been removed, and the area was ready for sampling. Just like with the Point Breeze hazardous waste storage pad, a plan was prepared, issued to the state. was a smaller area, so it involved less borings and less samples, but the same approach was used, targeting those locations that we expected have the greatest likelihood of finding releases, if there actually were releases, supplementing them by some random locations just to fill out the spatial distribution of what we might find. Samples were analyzed for, again, that very broad suite of chemicals, including materials or chemicals from the materials that might have been handled or managed as part of that waste stream. And then, unlike the other two areas, and you won't see this with the Girard Point hazardous waste pad, but in this case, spent caustic is actually quite, it's material that has a pH, which pH is really just the level of its corrosivity, a pH that is pretty high. So it's similar to, say, like bleach, or try to give you another example, like oven cleaner. That's a good one too. The material, spent caustic itself, would have a really high pH, I believe somewhere around 13. And so one of the things that we added for this specific area to help give us another piece of information that might indicate or hint at a release if one had actually occurred was we actually measured the levels of pH in soil, so that we had a soil pH meter, and it allows us to get readings of the levels of pH in the material that we were sampling. Same with the Point Breeze hazardous waste storage pad. You can see the locations, how they were laid out, again, focused towards places where we expected to find releases if they had occurred, and then supplemented by a couple of locations. So in this case, rather than a gray grid, you can see I've got a yellow grid on this figure, and you can see how those sampling points laid out. In this case, we found a lot less. We found nothing that exceeded the direct contact cleanup levels, and only benzene and lead were found in soil at concentrations greater than the soil to groundwater protection cleanup levels. And then the next slide, you can kind of see where some of those were found. I put on this slide the pH readings that we got from soil range between 6 and 8.2. Those are actually really close to what we would refer to as neutral pH. Neutral pH is 7. Thankfully, we didn't see any information here, any evidence in the soil pH readings that would hint at an actual release to the environment from these caustic tanks. The last area is called the Girard Point hazardous waste storage pad. The same thing. I'm showing you an image of when the pad was actually being used to support the refinery's operations. What was unique about this pad, it was actually used to support some of the demolition and decommissioning of the refinery itself. So this pad actually stayed in use for a longer period of time, a couple more years. And then you can see in 2024, we've got an image there of where you can see the pad has been actually demolished. Hopefully you're not getting too bored with the repetitive nature of this, but same thing. The plan was submitted to the state. The state reviewed it and approved it. We biased our locations. We supplemented them with locations that were selected on a 30-foot by 30-foot grid. And again, in this case, we actually collected some additional samples just to help us get some better sense of the nature and extent of what was found. And the same thing, the chemicals that were analyzed included those things that we are normally looking for at the refinery, but then supplementing them with chemicals that we thought could be present in the wastes that were actually stored temporarily on this pad. And then this is the graphic that just shows you that. Again, same thing. I used a yellow grid in this case, but again, targeted locations supplemented by the grid-based, and then there was additional follow-up that occurred after. And in this case, we actually found another pH that was greater than the soil direct contact cleanup levels. And then we found 2 PAHs. We found benzene, a volatile organic chemical, and then arsenic and lead at concentrations that exceeded the soil to groundwater protection MSC. And then this is an image that basically shows you the distribution of those concentrations, roughly. So just to pull all this together, we have 3 areas. At the Point Breeze storage pad, we found PAHs and lead. At the Girard Point spent caustic tanks, we found benzene and lead. And then at the Girard Point storage pound, we found VOCs, specifically benzene. We found 2 pHs and arsenic and lead. So these are the things that everything else that was analyzed was equal to or less than these generic cleanup levels. So these chemicals really represent the things that we needed to do more work, more thinking, to understand, why are they here? Are they associated with a release from these units, or are they associated with something that's unrelated to these units? Now, just to flash a little bit to the conclusion, and I'll go through this in a little more detail. The pHs themselves and the metals, the arsenic and the lead, we were able to determine that they are associated with historic fill. Terribly surprising, but that was the conclusion from the work that we did. And then with regards to benzene, we had to do some additional work. Now, what is established in that agreement with the state, that supplement that I had mentioned earlier, was the application or the use of several lines of evidence as a tool to allow us to determine, or to help us determine, when we might have a release from a pad, from a unit, or whether we're finding something that is not associated with the unit. So in the case of benzene, which is really the kind of the unique thing, because it wouldn't be something that we would expect to find associated with historic fill. So we know that that's not the reason why benzene was found in those 2 areas in the south. But benzene is a chemical that we see across the facility at low levels. If you look at the graphic on the right, what you can kind of see is, again, this is every soil sample that has been collected at the refinery to date. And what you can see is that the concentrations of benzene range from everything from less than 1 milligram per kilogram all the way up to greater than 10,000 milligrams per kilogram, depending upon where you are and what were the activities or what happened in that particular area. In the case of these 2 locations, the caustic tanks and the Girard Point hazardous waste pad, you can see the concentrations that we found of benzene are very consistent with the kind of low-level conditions that we see across the facility. So basically the spatial distribution of what we found in proximity to these 2 areas is indistinguishable from what was found across the entire facility as essentially a kind of a low-level impact that you see. So our conclusion in the case of benzene, using this information, was that it is not associated with an actual release from these particular units. It's contamination that will have to be managed under Act 2, but it's not impacts that are associated with these 2 units. Now, this is a graphic intended to capture the conclusions or the elements of those individual lines of evidence that were noted or discussed in that agreement with the state. Again, these are a list of tools or a list of questions that we go through in order to help us figure out whether what we found is associated or potentially associated with a release from the unit, or whether it might be associated with some other condition that would have to be addressed under Act 2. So the types of things we asked. First of all, probably the most important thing I mentioned earlier, that these areas are subject to significant tracking and reporting and documentation. And thankfully, we don't have any documentation of any actual known releases from each of these units. Another question is, could the chemicals that we found, could they have been associated with what was stored here? Well, the answer to those is yes. I mean, we looked for them specifically because there was a potential for them to have been managed or handled in each of these areas. We looked at the spatial distribution of the chemicals and asked ourselves, is there evidence based on the spatial distribution that would suggest an actual release? We asked ourselves whether the chemicals could be associated with historic fill. As I mentioned earlier in the discussion, historic fill, you're potentially going to see things like metals and pHs, but not necessarily benzene. The other question is, are we finding chemicals that are associated with historic fill? And then the last element that we explored is whether we're seeing contamination that may be pre-existing or associated with other activities, other refinery use. And in the case of benzene, that was the actual conclusion we were able to determine as a result of the review. So overall, what we see are that small set of chemicals, the pHs, the metals, benzene. These are chemicals that are going to have to be managed under Act 2, but they are not evidence of releases from these individual storage areas. So what we're seeing is impacts from historic fill, from other activities, have to be managed under Act 2. And since the storage areas did not actually have evidence of release to the environment, we're proposing to the state that the obligations for clean closure have been met for each of these 3 units. Currently, right now, the state is reviewing 3 reports that were issued for each of these areas. They present the content that I basically just walked you through here during this discussion. If the state has any feedback, part of the next steps will include addressing or responding to any of the questions or feedback that they might have, and then subsequently finalizing those investigation reports. And then subsequent to their approval of those reports, PESRM would then submit a request for closure in order to get certification of the actual closure of these 3 units. And with that, I will open it up for any questions or comments as a result of it. So I appreciate you joining us tonight and listening to this walkthrough. Hopefully you found it interesting, and we look forward to any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. I see we have 2 written questions, and then I'm just going to remind, which I will answer here, and then just a reminder to anyone else who may have questions, if you want to ask your question, if you want to speak your question, just click the little raise your hand button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll unmute you so that you can ask your question, or you can type your question into the Q&A. But we have 2 questions typed into the Q&A. The first one from Dimitri. I see your question and your interest in connecting with me or Kevin, and certainly we can do that. And I have your email address from your registration, so we'll follow up with you on that. And then David, I'm seeing your question about remediating the site. So with respect to these 3 hazardous waste storage areas, sorry, let me just say in case folks can't see David's question. David is asking a question about impact to the groundwater beneath the property, and whether impacts to the groundwater beneath the property have the potential to impact groundwater in aquifers in New Jersey. And what I would say with respect to these 3 hazardous waste storage areas, as Kevin just talked about, we did not find evidence of releases from these 3 hazardous waste storage areas. So I would say with respect to these 3, we do not see impact to soil, and so we also do not see impact to groundwater. And I would say with respect to these 3 storage areas, we do not have any reason to believe there's impact to groundwater locally or at a distance away in New Jersey. With respect to the site more broadly, the former refinery, there are impacts to groundwater. HRP is responsible for releases that occurred after September 2012, and Sunoco and Evergreen is responsible for releases that occurred prior to that date. And so I would say tomorrow, Evergreen Sunoco has a public meeting, and that might be a better place to ask this question, because they have certainly done the broadest sampling and investigation and remediation of groundwater at the site. And then you're certainly welcome to also join our meeting on June 18th, which is our broader public meeting. Though I will say, with respect to the releases that have occurred after September 2012, none of those are so broad and sort of have been present for so long that they have the potential to impact groundwater quality at that distance in New Jersey. Those are our 2 written questions. Any other questions from the audience?
Juliana, we do have a raised hand.
Oh, great. Thanks, Corey.
From Chris, so I will allow him to ask his question.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Hi, my name is Chris DeGiulio from Physicians for Social Responsibility. I'm the environmental chemist. Thank you for the presentation. It was very
Welcome.
eye-opening. One of the concerns or kind of questions I have, I understand that this is ground samples and that, we're looking and evaluating as to what is going on, right? What you have. So one of my things is that, working in the public health sector, we're concerned about the benzene, obviously, because it can become it could get into the air. And I know we're looking at specifically on site. I want to know, or if there is plans to protect the public health when these projects start getting underway, that we're monitoring, at least in the community, for any types of raises or anything, because again, benzene in public health standards in our air should be zero. I understand the difficulties with a refinery. So I wanted it's a historical refinery and we're trying to figure out what to do to make it best. And so I just want to make sure that maybe within the further planning in this phase, these phases like that, we're at least considering getting baseline air monitoring up. I don't know if it is. So that's a question to just make sure when this stuff goes underway that, there's no further impacts to the community.
Hi, Chris. Can you hear me? My screen is going in and out on me. Okay,
I've got you.
I'm concerned that my internet connection is unstable. So if you lose me, that is what is going on. I'm going to answer your question quickly here, and then I would definitely encourage you to join our meeting on June 18th, just because the question of air monitoring not really related to this, but I can answer it quickly, so I will. And then if you have follow-up questions, come on the 18th, or you can submit questions through our website. But so with respect to benzene monitoring at the perimeter of the site, that is something that we did for a couple of years during the so let me back up. HRP acquired the property and the sort of in the non-operating refinery in the summer of 2020. For a little over a year prior to that, PES was conducting fence line monitoring for benzene during the operation of the refinery. We continued that monitoring for a couple of years during the demolition, and all of that data is available on our website. And if you can't find it, I can point you to where it is. Just send us a question. Since we are now no longer an operating refinery and are now an active construction site, our goal is to, let me just back up. The benzene monitoring, the way that was done is the samples were collected over a 2-week period. They were sent to a laboratory, and then you sort of get the laboratory results maybe 2 weeks after that. So a couple of weeks after. While we're working on site very actively on a construction site, we want information in more real time so that we can take action to do stuff while it's happening, not a month later. So we have a setup of perimeter air monitors that monitor dust and total volatile organic compounds. So not benzene specifically, because it's hard to measure one individual compound in real time, but measure total VOCs. So we monitor now at 10 locations. It was originally 6 locations because we started on the southern sort of portion of this property. That's where the construction started, the property that you're seeing that Kevin's showing here. Now we're working in the north as well. We've added 4 additional locations. We have 10 locations where we continually monitor dust and total VOCs, and our team gets notices in real time if those concentrations start to increase. Also on our website is a plan that explains how that monitoring is done and where those locations are. And then our data is posted monthly for those. So if you want to take a look at those, or if you can't find them, submit a question and I can point you to them. And then certainly if you have questions on the data, we can follow up.
I appreciate it. So I've been following the issue, but it's the first time I've come to one of these sessions. So thank you very much for answering the question.
Yeah, happy to. And then on the 18th, feel free to join. And we're happy to answer any follow-up questions.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You're welcome. And then I'm seeing another written question, Dimitri, the information about the later HRP meeting on June 18th. Email blasts will go out and it'll be posted on our website and our social media starting tomorrow. So if however you got notification about, if you received notification about this meeting, however you got that notice, you'll get notice about the meeting on the June 18th. That will start tomorrow. Okay, I'm not seeing any other written questions. Corey, any other hands raised?
Not at the moment.
We'll give it one more minute. Thanks everybody for joining. And if there are any other questions, please feel free to type in or virtually raise your hand. Okay, Corey, if no one else has raised their hand, I think we can thank everybody for their time. And please do join us on June 18th if you'd like to hear more about other parts of the project.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night.